Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming at this different time slot. We were trying to make sure that people would be able to make at least one of David's talks, and so we've sort of muddled up the time slots a little bit. So people who teach or in classes at a certain time wouldn't predictably be missing everything. I'm not going to give a full introduction to David Marriott's work today. I did that before the first lecture, which you will be able to see at some point on YouTube if you weren't on our YouTube channel, not just sort of generally, as long as he agrees to that after seeing how we edit it and make it look pretty and everything. You'll be able to have a fuller introduction then. I will just say that David has been in residence with us since the beginning of October. There's a short residency, a 2-week residency, thanks to the Schiff Family Humanities Fund, which is now allowing us to have 2 short residencies like this every year, which I think is a wonderful thing. So, as I said, I'm not going to give a full introduction to David's work. But by way of introduction, I thought I would briefly highlight some of the interventions that David raised in his previous talk, some of which may well resonate differently this week than they did last week, even as, indeed, perhaps because, but I'll leave that for historians to decide, we listened to an analysis of thinkers attempting to understand the relationship between truth and lie. Beginning with Paul de Man's reading of Crisis and Criticism, Crisis and Contemporary Criticism in its article version, which became the first chapter of Blindness and Insight, and specifically the passage in which he writes, de Man writes, the rhetoric of crisis states its own truth in the mode of error. It is itself radically blind to the light it admits. David analyzed this I think that implicitly, noting that de Man has Nietzsche's Truth and Lie in the extramoral sense lurking somewhere in the background. David focused on both the problem of attending to the question of crisis as an apeiron of language, but also the way that the rhetoric of crisis becomes, in a way, a person, one blind to the light it admits. David asks of this, what does the language of crisis gain? Why does the language of crisis gain prestige, given that the subject who has to think of crisis finds the production of crisis as unfathomable? What would the implications be for subjecthood and beyond when one asks, what happens to crisis when it is overlooked? What is it? What is at stake when we indulge crisis on the one hand, and what happens when we do not even acknowledge the long and seemingly endless forms of crisis that go unrecognized and seem unfathomable? David turned to psychoanalysis, which has famously addressed the question of the truth claim and the lie claim. What is a truth and what is a lie? How is it that through, and specifically for David, through Wilfred Bion, one may assume that a thinker is necessary for the lie and not for the truth? In order to address this thought, through the claim to truth and subjecthood, the genre of confession, David turned to Fanon, specifically 2 essays on confession, who was trying to understand, in those essays, the status of the court confession for the questionably insane North African Muslim who categorically cannot tell the truth in the eyes of the French legal system in Algeria. Algeria, as we know, was 3 administrative units of France, not conceived as a separate country administratively, though with different legal apparatus. In the context of permanent civil war then, which is the phrase that is used, then gets taken up by others later, for example, Carl Schmitt, when he talks about the future of the permanent civil war after the nomos changes, after the Second World War, the nomos of the law. So in the context of permanent civil war, then what does a lie or a truth look like? And what are the implications of that for the subject of speech or the perpetrator if we have acknowledged that crisis can only be fathomable to one who doesn't acknowledge its perpetual nature? What would it mean then to confess to a Black truth, is the question that David asked us. With that, I'm going to stop and welcome him back to the stage.
Thank you, Ranji, for again, another thoughtful, provocative introduction, which I won't be able to match, I don't think, in terms of providing an answer or judgment of. But and also thanks to everybody who've made this residency such a thought-provoking, but also very interesting event for me in so many different ways, including Ranji's seminars, but also the staff associated with the residency, Michael, Pamela, have been, utterly generous towards me in terms of making things run smoothly. So this second lecture, which I twinned, so I'm going to present you a second proposition today, following on from my first. But I just want to add one more thing to Ranji's summary. So I want to take up again one aspect of something which was marked, I tried to mark out in lecture 1. So consider the following statement: thinking has to be called into existence to cope with thoughts. That's from Bion. And then he goes on to ask, why is thinking a development forced on the psyche by the pressure of thoughts? Unquote. So such an idea seems to reverse the usual relations between cogito and ergo sum. But consider, if we follow Bion's formula, thought is always a disturbance, a crisis to thought. It's a pressure which we can choose to either evade or modify. Those are his words. Too much pressure can lead to a breakdown in thought or the capacity for thought, which leads to an impasse in thinking itself. If that pressure cannot be sustained, it cannot be conveyed. But if there's no pressure, there can be no thought. No crisis without pressure then, and no thinking without the pressure of thought. So one of the things I wanted to kind of raise in lecture 1 in terms of truth and lie is what this formula allows us to think and prevents us from thinking. What the formula does not allow us to account for is why frustration, as a telos, an origin of thought, precedes our capacity to think it, nor why the difference between them requires that the mother, as a source and limit of frustration, act as a limit set upon thought, and thus the limit to crisis in the mind's affection on itself. But the formula is equally unhelpful in explaining why this utterly random drive to think and so express thought must be connected to our ability to tolerate and so contain the fears and conflicts of particular thoughts that, insofar as they reflect the power or pressure of the mind, are the very thoughts that also threaten the possibility or existence of thought itself. Now, the upshot of all this is that thought must first evacuate itself as thought in order to be able to think, evacuate the excessive, dangerous proximity of certain thoughts, which are aroused or generated by frustration. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, and my case history is a kind of object relations theory, is why frustration, this frustration which leads to thought, becomes in particular racialized. That's one of the questions I wanted to depict in lecture 1. And so in lecture 2, what I'm going to do is pursue that question, frustration and race, via the figure of blackness. which I didn't really speak about specifically in lecture 1. Now, lecture 2, object relations theory. And I think to make my argument clearer, I'm going to begin with a reading, an object relations theory text, which presents a certain reading of what they call the Negro problem. And that reading depends on 2 words, the word very, and another that lays claim to it in its uncertainty, the word tolerate, which I've just mentioned myself, which here means the capacity to live with doubt of all that can be known. Let me just offer you this reading to illustrate what I'm trying to get at, and then I'll turn to my second proposition. So one of the most interesting things about the Pill and the Moon, a 1969 talk given by Donald Winnicott, is how thought, when it is damaged or disturbed, assimilates what he calls blackness to the murderous work of unconscious fantasy. Winnicott's illustration of the point includes a 16-year-old English girl who was, quote, born with a cord around my neck, unquote, which affected her mental capacity, but whom he says needs to be on the pill, the contraceptive pill, because she has met, quote, a very black African, unquote, to whom Winnicott tells us the idea of having sex with him was, quote, very exciting for her, unquote. The word very leaves vague what can only be defined as an exquisite implication, namely of an excitement engorged by its own expression, to the extent that the word having, quote, to have a black man having the pill, unquote, expresses what she hasn't got and what frantically, terribly, Winnicott tells us she couldn't deal with, unquote, rather than something she could. His second example is that of a dream of, quote, a most beautiful white object, unquote, which is the head of a child, and which leads him to say, and again I quote, and in my dream, before I woke, I said, this has nothing to do with the Negro problem of black and white. It goes right behind it. It has to do with the black and white that is in the individual human being. And there it was, unquote. There what was? Is that which hides the Negro problem the same as what reveals it? Is the drive to kill, Winnicott's word, beautiful white babies through this desire for the very black, or what emerges from it, a problem then of blindness, or is the problem one of what he calls an acute crisis, unquote, that produces an exaggerated excitement in the woman who would assume responsibility for what the word very exposes? It is, however, equally odd and fascinating to discover why the desire to have sex with a very black man should indicate an incapacity to, quote, contain, to hold, to tolerate things, unquote. First, because this suggests a lack of depth in a reality. These are Winnicott's words. Second, because there's clearly a racial element to the crises that reveal that incapacity and a way of remarking on them. And these are quotes from the lecture. There's a cord around that child. There's a rope around that person's neck. Again, unquote, which seems to want to move away from the discussion of anti-black murder in this desire to that of contraception. And because I think such a shift raises a problem about what exactly is being hidden or revealed by Winnicott's own words. At this point, it is hard to tell whether the Negro problem leads to murder or absence or crisis, or why the thought of it should culminate strangely in such an odd assortment of tropes. But it is also unclear what the word tolerate is being used as evidence for. For interracial desire, quote, he was a very black African, which didn't seem to make any difference in their family, unquote. But what difference is being attended to here? The suspicion that is more or less hidden behind that didn't seem, or its lack thereof. The question of what difference makes or does not does seem to end up as a question of birth or desire, as a right to white lucidity, as an obligation or duty to come to the right white decision, to choose the beautiful white over the very black, or to judge or know it truly, deeply, thoughtfully, beyond the inadequacy of our black-white illusions. A Negro problem that, Winnicott tells us, has nothing to do with, his words, being, life, thought, or futurity. And you could add here reproductive futurity, if that makes it clearer. The most curious feature of the shift and conflict between the desire for the very black and the desire not to have a beautifully white child is that it should take place at all. We have got to tolerate the contradictions, Winnicott tells us. We have got to tolerate the tensions that have got to be carried around with us and that make us doubtful about everything and that make us value doubt, unquote. I find that modulation, doubtful about everything, but make us value doubt. Typical Winnicott is kind of beautiful. But anyway, moving on. Otherwise, we risk reducing thought to a kind of paranoid fear of absolute destruction. For my part, I do not see why the need to form attachments should be informed by a racialized fear of uncertainty, nor why an inability to resign ourselves to doubt should lead to an intolerance that is therefore false, or to borrow Winnicott's words, seemingly false. Evidently, what is to be remembered here is that it is very difficult to tolerate uncertainty, hence the need for the pill. Quote, I simply must have it in order to contain desire itself, or in this particular instance, desire for the very black. No one is more intolerant of unconscious fantasy than the general public, Winnicott tells us. The problem, however, is why that intolerance should lead to murder and destruction. Winnicott's answer is kind of suggestive, and it's a typical object relations answer. Quote, before hate, in a sense, object relating involves destruction. Anti-black hatred is then no easier than, perhaps no different from, discovering our inability to tolerate absolute destruction, that is, our inability to cope with acute crises. That eventuality means that blackness is, and I use this phrase, I don't like it, always already intolerable and at a primal level. I think the entire argument could hinge here on a very precise definition or difference between tolerate and tolerable, but maybe we can come back to that. The explicit and deeply pervasive idea that blackness cannot be posited to mean life seems to present a radical disjunction between blackness and being, as well as blackness and the two functions of mental life according to object relations theory, namely reparation and destruction. If neither is possible without the other, neither is reducible to the other. Even the plea for tolerance that Winnicott's assertions of doubt allow finds no support within the fantasies, anti-black fantasies of his text in all of its most destructive ambivalence. Thinking, as it is thought in The Pill and the Moon, is, I think, anti-black. It murders it as irrelation, as anti-life, and a logos. Why do I say this? Please bear with me. I think my argument is that Winnicott can no more distinguish between white desire and anti-black destructiveness than he can come up with a definition of a legitimately white desire to have a black child. The thought that could tolerate such acceptance, Annahme in the German, cannot itself be tolerated or upheld. Accordingly, the desire for murder, which is the subject of this lecture, must itself be murdered as a black object relation. And since the dream of the beautiful white cannot exist without murdering the very black, we must ask what it is that gives tolerance, such a terrible intolerance, as a relation. This is why the essay is so disturbing and a somewhat graphic illustration of why, to use Winnicott's own words, hatred as object relation makes it impossible to separate the most prized and idealized reparations from the most aggressive impulses and fantasies. For what repairs, since it articulates, thinks, and links, cannot posit or reflect on what it hates, repudiates, and resists. It can only obliterate or envy it because of its own murderous idealization. We could say that if an object relation is equivalent to tolerance, precisely because it resides in doubt, in uncertainty, that is because it does nothing but affirm the intolerance that subsists through its own positing of a racial certitude, which is, I argue, the real redoubt of its performative speech. So it's kind of this reading, which I'm presenting, is kind of a crude, very reductive summary of a kind of elusive text. But I think I can extract some general propositions about object relations theory and how it presents blackness. And I'm going to just summarize those again in order to move on quickly to my second proposition. So blackness in object relations theory thus initially stands for no hyphenated thing, nothing, to the extent that no object as such can be found in it. Blackness is the name of all that cannot be named. It is spoken of wherever language or thought fails at reparation. Blackness is a signifier that is not only opposed to life, given its relation to, quote, the silent kill of the babies, unquote, but is associated with our inability to tolerate our frustrations with things. Since, however, the very fetic act of trying to expel or abolish or murder frustration makes us doubtful about everything and makes us value doubt, these are all Winnicott's words, blackness is a signifier that cannot be assigned either meaning or sense as a fetic object. Or blackness is a name that allows object relations to posit an ontological frustration behind every object relation. So if you follow through on the logic of what I'm saying, what I am saying is precisely this. Blackness is a non-relation that causes thought to radically doubt itself and, incapable of assuming a meaning, is removed from our ability to see and know right lucidity. So it marks in language and thought an ineffaceable denegation, an apeiron, to use that word, which Ranji used at the beginning, that is also a kind of real intrusion. And again, what Winnicott draws from this is what I believe to be as follows. It marks an inability to know unwantedness from murder, intolerance from equivocation, and a confusion of what he calls womanliness, associated here with the loss of true mothering, his words, with the sexual excitement of non-being itself. Yet, if blackness is also always the murderous incertitude of language that, like the very black, has to be warded off or evaded, then this evasion, in its intolerance and murder, is also an absolute resistance to thought's own illegitimate need to destroy itself, and one which is itself based on an inability not to confuse destruction with the purifying work of logical certainties. And again, the point I'm trying to make is that blackness cannot be posited as anything but this unsettling irrelation which disturbs the entire order of thinking, imagining, and judging as performative acts. So with that in mind, and again, it's a kind of brutally reductive summary of a complex text, I want to move on to my second proposition, which is contentious. Right, so the context behind this kind of somewhat paradoxical statement is the argument used by the pro-life movement that the fetus, the unborn fetus, is equivalent to a slave. It's an analogy which makes slavery the first object relation, but also the first experience of true and untrue thought, pressure of thought. Now, to illustrate this proposition, I'm going to present to you a reading of a Black text which deals with object relations. So the analogy that the slave as a fetus produces a number of perverse effects, writes Jared Sexton in his provocative 2015 essay called Unbearable Blackness. And the context of this his reading, I shall give as follows. So he describes the analogy as perverse, but it forms part of a wider question, and which again is politically quite relevant. He says, how do we understand the appeal that Black life matters? On what grounds is it recognizable as life? And can Blackness ever be decided upon as a pro-life decision? So the Sexton's essay forms part of a dossier dedicated to Michael Brown, who was murdered by a white police officer in 2014. There is, I think, a connection between this murder, which opens the essay, and Sexton's striking and deeply pessimistic insistence on what he calls the originary non-value, unquote, of Black life as life. But equally, if there's no value to that life, what would it mean to give birth to it, to assume or take responsibility for it? And precisely when even, quote, the children know that innocence is not Black, unquote. Indeed, can such knowledge ever be innocent? In their knowing innocence, we are told, these children are able to grasp the distance that separates Blackness from being, Blackness from value, and life. And as they grow older, they will become more conscious of this separation as an event that precedes being, stroke natality itself. So if you follow through what he's saying, not only is there no way to become a Black child without this precocious or overdeveloped sense of one's non-relation, there's no way to be a child without having to come to terms with such knowledge, which has already imposed itself on Black prenatal life. Further, one cannot be Black and not know this knowing at the origin of one's psyche and mental life. On the other hand, if the only choice is to live a non-valued life, and I say non-value, not valueless, non-valued life, what then can this decision mean for a life that seems to start from its knowledge? And on the other hand, involves what he calls an inhuman excess lived outside of the limits of the law, unquote. So I think it's this knowledge which is being evoked in the title of his essay as unbearable. That knowledge is unbearable. But I think it has wider implications for how we understand Blackness as an object relation to the world, in the sense of this kind of originary non-value. How do we understand this relationship? So that's the context underlying this proposition. I now want to go into some more detail into Sexton's own reading. And again, he asks a series of questions as he leads into this reading of the pro-life argument that the fetus is actually enslaved. So in terms of blackness, he says, what does it mean to give birth to or be born as a black child? What does this child bring into the world in which it appears? What then is the relationship between birth and blackness? Can the world ever think about blacks as children? Does the black child belong to a world, or should they indeed be protected from it? A world in which murderous resentment often takes the place of justice and or knowledge. These questions of what it means to be born as or into non-value are not the same as Winnicott's sense that destruction belongs to object relating. Before hate, in a sense, object relating involves destruction, a citation which I gave a few moments ago. On the contrary, what is tolerable, again, going back to that word, or bearable, but is not itself considered to be human, can be withdrawn from or absolved of all relation. And especially when the act of having a child is in effect the same thing as owning it. There is, I think, the strong sense in Sexton's essay, albeit never really commented on, that blackness can never know itself objectively, because of a hatefulness that destroys it at every turn, and which is endless and gratuitous in its transferability and mobility. Or that hatred cannot be modified or evaded at the level of thought or at the level of thinking. In fact, the hatefulness referred to is not one of object relation, but one of what he calls an excess, that is thereby denied any relational capacity and from which the world withdraws, or indeed, I would argue, enjoys itself. Moreover, that excess impairs all object relations and does harm to our very ability to judge a child apart from what the judgments that condemn it and that withdraw it from being. Now, one could go into history to make a whole series of arguments, history of law, history of American race relations, to say that the slave is never indeed a child. And certainly not in law. But that's not where I want to go. I want to concentrate more on the pro-life analogy between the slave and the fetus, which is indeed not making the claim that the slave is a child. It's saying something else. Now, again, I don't think the analogy is based on knowing whether something is or is not. I don't think it's based on that claim. Now, in Black critical legal theory, especially when it comes to the slave, and we talked about this in the seminar yesterday, if you read Spillers and a whole range of other people, the question of what constitutes a slave is a separation of natality from reproduction, kinship from genealogy, generation from being, and time. But key to all of these various texts is a slave cannot become. It is possessed, but not by becoming. Indeed, it disturbs immanence, for it constitutes a dissemination, I use that word, without belonging, or it is an absence, constructed absence, which is then symbolically imprinted by law, but is also at the same moment dispossessed of any symbolic reference or name. There's so many texts in which deal with this as a kind of caesura. But given all of these negations. The question which still matters is this caesura, what Spillers calls breaching or breach, is still mothered as a blood relationship to life and body. Without a mother, there can be no slave, but the Black mother is herself a slave. So how does non-value give birth to non-value that then acquires the status or the place of value? What does mothering do to non-value? It is already clear, I think these questions cannot be separated from the analogy. They all already form part of the analogy in terms of its complex history. But what I'm also arguing that is the analogy is implicitly based on fetus being racially marked in its whiteness. And it's that whiteness which makes it meaningful to law. So let me explain what I'm trying to get at here. I think it's this issue that Sexton's article is drawing attention. Indeed, we might say that in his essay, the subject in crisis is never or no longer simply a subject of law or of knowledge, or even the subject of a thought without a thinker, but what he calls a subjectum that corresponds to the unborn. The unborn that has no origin or propriety as life or as right. And again, he pursues the analogy in terms of why is the womb a slave estate? What does it mean to talk about the interuterine middle passage that makes this unfree life of the subject possible? All of these are relevant questions, but again, they're not getting at the nitty-gritty, what I call the nitty-gritty of the argument. So let's try and get to it. In my time that I have left. So I turn now to my second proposition. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to jump forward. Sorry, I'm going to cut out a lot of this reading, but there's a moment in Unbearable Blackness when Sexton cites Danny McLean's "The murder of Black youth is a reproductive justice issue." McLean writes of the, quote, "the right to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and healthy environments," unquote. But what if the danger or the threat to be avoided is enshrined in the notion of right itself? Maybe we can come back to this question. Perhaps the language of choice is just as perverse here, and I use that word echoing back to the Sexton, as is the language of right. Is the child's right to a furiously destructive internal world commensurable to that perversely unsafe environment called the world? In object relations, it is precisely the language of rights that could be the most punishing here, or where the limits between safe and unsafe environments between Black children and the world that surrounds them breaks down. If Black psychic reality is a state of captivity, how does one make it capable of expressing a right? How does one save or repair stolen life? Again, to answer these questions, I think we need to move away from the idea that life and liberty are ever simply juridical questions, but form part of an ontological limit to the question of capacity itself. What I'm saying is that Blackness makes the understanding of being and life aphoretic and or impossible, but only insofar as the right to life can be seen to be immune to or segregated from what is being referred to here as the abysses of slavery. It's not by chance, then, that the exaltation of life, the exaltation of right as a decision and a choice, guides a sense of labor rather than one of servitude. Nor is it by chance that over and beyond the question of unborn slave life, it could be argued that it is Black life that represents the greatest form of danger, and precisely because it is said to be a death in life that allows absence or right to be made present, but via the separation of the act of impregnation as speculative metaphysical profit from any notion of conatus. So again, in the passages I've skipped over, I'm trying to make a distinction between Black life and what has become known as biopolitical life. And what I'm trying to say by making that distinction is why it is not surprising, to use that figure again, that Sexton's thought should evolve to the point where he can say that Blackness is literally unbearable in the sense of its reproducibility and or understanding. However, this is not because, as Sexton puts it, it represents a danger where all founding distinctions are lost, but because Blackness is taken to occupy a place in between person and thing, time and being, precisely because this is a place that is indeterminate, or what I'm here calling a nepa, even though it is perpetually made to disclose the subject in all of its servitude and desire. The symbol of the slave fetus is thus bound to a kind of fatal ordering of judgment. That judgment can no wise be taken to be merely a pro-life intuition or a makeshift political claim in the language of rights, which would therefore be reduced to a kind of anti-Roe versus Wade. Several people make that argument, but that's not my concern here. The analogy, as I'm reading it here, is more constructed as a question of judgment and freedom. The slave fetus is not the abridgment of a freedom that would pre-exist it. It is the masked or allegorical statement of the law and its fiction, as well as the limits of its validity. And there's something in the pro-life argument which suggests, although it's probably never ever said as such, that we are all enslaved by law, or the judicium, by which no subject can become or be, and to which we are all always unequal. Another way of putting this is to say that, or more accurately, we cannot receive or cannot contain or think the crisis by which we all relate to being, the crisis that defines us and enslaves us as persons without identifying with this kind of primordial enslavement by law. I'm not saying I agree with any of these propositions. I'm just trying to tease out the meaning of the analogy. And again, I'm just going to jump forward a bit, trying to get you more inside Sexton's essay. And I give you a quote here. See if I've got it. When applied with some rigor, the analogy between the denial of legal personhood to the fetus and the denial of legal personhood to the slave, alongside the identification of the pro-life movement with the moral forces generated by the social and political revolution of the whole Black freedom struggle, produces a number of perverse effects. So I would encourage you to read this essay, because as he zeroes in on these perverse effects, he unravels a kind of series of quite acute paradoxes. whereby the refusal to be aborted is equated to a decision to be unborn, to be a black vita, if only for a moment. And that is because, he argues, the very right to be free, to be born, to have an existence is a decision that disavows its own negrophobic logic of judgment into a reparative symbol of white fragility. That's a bit of a mouthful, but I think you get what I'm trying to get at. The unwillingness to be born black, or to be entirely free from such, is a kind of nothing which allows a sense of enslaved unbirth, non-birth, to be made possible. Again, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. A way to, I suppose, to encapsulate this is to look at the way in which the pro-life movement, entire pro-life movement argument relies on a kind of association. See if I can find a quote from the paper itself to illustrate this association, whereby I think there's a reverend who, Clenard Childress, no pun intended, Reverend Clenard Childress, who writes, "The most dangerous place for an African-American to be is in the womb of their African-American mother," unquote. So again, there's no question here of the rights of the mother, but this idea of maternity or the womb as the most dangerous place, perversely, I would argue, echoes an idea, an unbearable idea of enslavement. So if black fetuses matter, if black life matters, it can only do so, they can only do so by escaping the social deaths of their mothers. That seems to be behind this reverend's remark. They can only become life by warding off her fatal embrace. But if, qua choice, the mother remains master of her property, and what that means historically is a kind of a weird question, she can only give birth to blackness, or to the child, sorry, by negating it as black. So if a black mother is to extend to her child life as right, that life can only be inventoried as a non-black life. I mean, this raises a whole series of questions about law, justice, persona, which I've gone into in this kind of complicated paper, but it's not, I don't think it's right or proper for me to read out this kind of intricate writing in the form of a lecture. So I'll just end with some general comments. I hope I've made clear what I've said here, and why this idea of kind of prenatal enslavement or natal enslavement are not saying the same things. But what I'm also saying is that these are not just theoretical questions about our relations to objects in the mental and psychic life of the subject. They need to be understood literally, politically, culturally, historically. I think we all know this. So I'm basically saying what I think is an obvious point. But in terms of crisis, and the crisis which has arisen in the kind of generalized assault on reproductive rights, I'm interested in how the insistence on the inalienable rights of the fetus has now become marked by a kind of evocation of slavery, which is in the absence of an acknowledgement of blackness. So how does this relate to the question of crisis more generally? What I said in lecture 1 is that what defines crisis, according to how it's read in philosophy and psychoanalysis, is that the subject in crisis does not often know itself to be in crisis. But this itself does not mean that the crisis is unknown. Instead, we need to see why in each instance a choice had to be made, and unthought, that we have no way of knowing, but that we can't avoid thinking about except in terms of crisis. Even if the crisis to be determined cannot be determined according to any concept of crisis. That's the deconstructed point. What I'm here calling the NAPA. And if this NAPA cannot be fought, then I would say unexceptionally and uncontroversially, I would say neither can blackness as crisis. I suppose that's the most basic point I've been trying to make over these two lectures. So it's 1 o'clock. I've been speaking for quite a while. I think rather than continue, I will just draw it to an end there. Yeah, I will end. So, I mean, this is taking us in some murky waters in terms of object relations theory, but there's in Beyond's conception about what he calls the developmental history of thought precedes thinking. So, and again, it's the intolerable pressure of certain thoughts that induces us developmentally to arrive at the process or capacity for thinking, which is, for Beyond, an attempt to contain what is unbearable about certain thoughts. And he calls this an inborn problematic or inborn disposition to arrive at a conception of frustration, which itself contains frustration. So the point of his lecture, maybe I'm being too clever here, is to show how that kind of question of intolerance at the origins of thought itself, how that becomes racially linked to the very notion of what it means to have a relation to an object. And again, in relation to an object, whether it's the object is a thing in itself or merely the conception of the thing in itself. Because Beyond's text does refer to, you know, what is thinking, does refer to Kant several times. So it's like an attempt to come up with a theory of thought which is not based on the categories of the understanding, but is based on what he calls there a question of frustration. But what I also noticed when I was, researching this lecture is that sense of uncertainty, ontological uncertainty, which propels us into thinking, has distinctly racialized meanings attached to it, which are unwitting, but repeated often in work texts by Klein, Winnicott, Riviere, Deutsch. You could just go on and on and on. Why is that? That was my basic question. Yeah. So, there are, in Scott, everyday senses of the word tolerate. It's like the meaning conveyed is something of becoming an habituation. So, tolerance is built up over time. That's a phrase which people use a lot. Talk about everything from drugs to, friendships. But tolerable is about a kind of capacity to think something or represent something or present something. And as I was saying, in these texts, working at the most abstract level, by the way, even though they're talking about, hatreds and idealizations. They are working at what is thought? How does it relate to being? That kind of question. What does it relate to? How does truth and lie relate to thought and being? Those kinds of questions. They there seems to be a kind of common sensual idea of tolerance, I would say, socio-political, what you're calling, which then gets smuggled in to a kind of ontological argument about thought itself. I think enslavement is an interesting one here because it's drawing upon history to deny history, to deny the relevance of a certain history, but it's also about trying to grasp something about the relationship between being and what it means to be and is. Like, you know, why does this pro-life movement think that the fetus is and is, and that is can only be conveyed by comparing it to enslavement? That to me is very weird. I still don't understand where it's coming from, but I am intrigued as to what you guys think of it being I don't want to presume, from America, and yeah, I'm living here. Yeah. Because I mean, to me, it just seems, I think I'll keep on harping on this word perverse. It strikes me as deeply perverse. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. That's is it causing frustration because it's the intolerant? It's, right?
Yeah, so it has to be modified or evaded.
And that's why I'm just
yes.
And that the intolerable non-being of thought is blackness.
It can be. It can be. I mean, and it also might be sexuality. This girl's desire to have, in the absence of what Winnicott calls mental capacity to know the difference between having and not having, which is very, again, pointed. Yeah, you're right there. Yeah, okay. So I understand where you're going with that. So the way in which I understand this thought, there's something intolerable about thought itself, which forces us to try and go beyond thought into thinking. So thought, in a sense, is always a disturbance to itself. Yeah, being intolerable. It results in an acute crisis, which you then have to convert, translate into something else in order to process it. What I think Sexton is getting at with this word unbearable, and I translating into intolerable, is the idea of a life which cannot be born, which cannot enter into being. And that's what I mean by the word blackness here, because in the text that I've been reading, that tends to for those of you who don't know this, the way in which pregnancy and slavery come together in American history is through these black codes or laws, and one of which is partus sequitur ventrum, which refers to the perpetual slavery of the womb. So, you know, the offspring follows the womb. So there is a way in which non-value is always part of reproductive value or reproductive futurity, in a way which Edelman doesn't even touch on in his work, which is a limit to what that work can do. So I think the intolerable, unbearable, the black fetus is removed from right, from life, by a kind of a question of value or the imposition of a value which precedes it. I mean, you know, I mean, the kind of most of the cultural histories talk about that value as property relation. But I actually want to talk about the way in which property relations always already rely upon a prior racialized object relation, which is never taken into account. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking, you know, the Sarah Kaufman essay on the Rembrandt community, which is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Talk. She's talking there about the, I mean, it's partly it's the organization of the figures, the guild of doctors and figures becoming, looking at this corpse in order to deny the fact that it's a corpse.
Right.
What's intolerable about it is that it's dead.
Right? Okay. Okay.
And function of it as a corpse model is to teach about life.
Right. Right.
Moving that direction.
Yeah.
There's also a big book that's in well. So there's this sort of interesting way in which there's this movement between in terms of the eyes of looking at the body and not looking at the body at all. And she's talking about kind of shuffling back and forth.
Mm.
So, you know, to some extent, it is a kind of thought dark argument that's going on with a kind of swing of the eye, which is about presence and non-presence.
Mm.
And it's based around this question of the dead as the intolerable.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying, I mean, my questions, I suppose, were coming partly from that, because that term intolerable is the one that she uses.
Mm.
To some extent, she talks about speculation rather than thinking happening in relation to the intolerable. I mean, just speculation.
Mm.
I'm wondering whether this idea of speculation and the question of value and price and the enslaved, where that the NEPA, especially as we've been thinking in terms of the abortion discourse of sex, sits in relation to debt. I mean, I'm just sort of, I don't even think that's a question. Maybe I'm just having
yeah. I mean, the word I used wasn't just the dead or the corpse or the it was the murdered, and it's Winnicott who introduces the question of murder to talk about contraception, and but also to talk about the ways in which we'd rather murder thought, imagination, judgment, babies than tolerate the intolerable or uncertainty. You see, and the way in which he's presenting the text, which again is slightly disturbing to me, is the way in which murder is easier to tolerate than uncertainty.
Yeah, and in a sense, the body, the corpse, is the corpse of Keith, who has no right over his corpse. So, I mean, there's also that.
Yeah. I think Katie had a word, and then. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oops. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. 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 No. Yeah. No. That you've said it very well. I feel like the one of the ways in which you could perhaps conjure up this pro-life movement rhetoric, which is a good word, is there's no space for doubt. Yeah. But what's odd about that then is how you then would mirror that kind of concern with life to the Winnicott concern with life, which is also arguing precisely for doubt. And but it's a Winnicott text which also introduces the question of murder as the social political consequence of not incorporating doubt. So I think what Sexton's paper allows us to maybe ask, and again goes back to what you were saying, is that there's a form of intolerance which precedes the distinction between tolerance or tolerate and intolerance, and which is not simply hate or denial or indeed doubt or uncertainty. It's something else. Now, what is that kind of intolerance? I don't know. But the fact that it can be reined in or intruded into or included into the very notion of life itself, before we even talk about property, capital representations, is kind of interesting to me, but not in a good way. I mean, because, yeah, he's saying that the pro-life is co-opting notions of freedom, liberation, emancipation, and enslavement in a way which brackets out kind of racial inequalities. And again, I understand what he's saying, but I feel like I'm going in a slightly different direction with it. I think you had a question, sir. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Mhm. 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 Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Oh, there's lots going on there. I mean, do you have a question? I can link what you're saying. Hmm. Ah, okay. Yes, yes. Yes. Yeah, positive, I'm not sure about, but there's several people. I mean, Sexton would be one of them, who's written on the what he calls the social life of social death, and how that becomes a kind of reproductive sequence. Now, you give born to yourself as socially dead, and the ways in which one comes into being just reinforces that sense of exclusion. I try and hedge my bets a bit in terms of how that figure gets evoked, because if it's neither alive nor dead, what causes its unbearability or its intolerableness is this incertitude about its status. But what makes it intolerable is precisely the fact that it cannot be made to fit into these binary oppositions. We were talking about this in a seminar. That's what makes sex for some so difficult to think about, because sexuality, because it escapes certain identities. So that would be how I respond to the difference, say, between Blackness, which I would never confuse with the phenomenological experience of individuals or people, as you put it. Even though it gets loaded onto them, it is not the same thing as them. And so politically, it's important to keep in mind that distinction, because I'm not reifying Blackness. I'm trying to understand the discourse, which actually is reproduced in philosophy, in psychoanalysis, in law, and those are the three discourses that go to make up this kind of text. Now, there's also several thinkers in, again, contemporary Black critical thought who want to really hold on to the affirmative question of Black life. Again, though, if you're going to hold on to that notion of affirmation, how does it relate to this kind of, again, uncertainty problem? What's being affirmed? The uncertainty, or that which goes beyond the incertitude or the intolerability? Because if you're just affirming that which has been negated, you don't free yourself from the logic of inversion. You're just repeating it. And I feel like it's important not to get trapped into logic whereby one is simply affirming or denying something, whatever that is. So the most important word in this for me is personhood, which is, I think, as he rightly says, a juridical notion of what constitutes a person. And it's that notion which is the bearer of rights. And that's what's central to this kind of big debate, which we all are seeing the consequences of in terms of the attack on reproductive rights. But underpinning this notion of legal personhood in the pro-life movement is this idea of inalienability. Again, it's the logic of certitude. We know that this has X. We know that this thing has life, and there's no doubt. So a more positive reading, to go back to your point, of psychoanalysis is say that psychoanalysis is a discourse which allows us to keep open doubt, perhaps, or the problem of uncertainty without reducing it to what it is not. But going back to your point, there are moments in all of these texts, Beyond's, Winnicott's, and all the others, where there is the question of what is does get reduced very quickly to a kind of racialization, which I find problematic. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Okay. Yeah. Mm.
And I'm curious about
Mm.
is the psyche an evidence for the normal, or is there something that doesn't overlap, that doesn't suit it completely? And then I found myself thinking ego, sort of.
Yes.
You know, but then the ego is, I would not equate the ego with the psyche.
Yes.
And so it still leaves a curious opening, stepping out of the ideologization of like disorder.
Yes.
Without it having to be unitary.
Yes.
And so I'm just curious about your thoughts about that. And I mean, partly this was a question I wanted to ask you: is it possible?
Yeah.
Not a whole lot of people takes some flavor, intellectual flavor, people see like this, because I do think the newspaper, the syllabus, noting of it as transparency pieces is the one that makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
Apply
Yeah. Yeah, so there's two questions there. Epidermalization is something I've written about, so I'm not going to refer to at work, but the figure of the epidermal is both psychic and phenomenological, obviously. And it's complicated because, in Freud, he talks about the projection of a surface. And yesterday we were talking about how sex intrudes as a kind of curving of a space. So when Fanon is talking about how blackness becomes manifested psychically, he doesn't use the word curving. He uses words which are much more damaging. So it's corrosive, acidic, a dye bleeding into a surface. So it's not that one doesn't have an awareness of the body, or the body is ego. It's just that the way in which it's already assumed that one enters into the world as embodied, because there's a fracture which enters into it, which one is not only aware of oneself, but aware of, as oneself having been carved up into composites. And he uses those words, being carved up, and he says, I wanted to be in the world, walk into the world in this kind of sense of having a corporeal schema, integral corporeal schema, and then when these fantasies, discourses intrude, there's something irreparable introduced, which can never be simply gainsaid, and not at a conscious level either. It's introduced in the way in which one is surveyed, policed, handled, spoken to, carried, not carried, bumped. I mean, so again, this is not a conscious event which suddenly happens to you. So the notion of a veil is somewhat misleading here, the Du Boisian notion of a veil, because it's not as if you could peel away these veils and suddenly the world is revealed to you. No, the veil is already in part of the body. I mean, if you want to, I don't use the word veil, but that kind of screen is already implicit. In terms of uneducating or re-educating subjects, that's not my forte. I am because a lot of the questions I'm dealing with are not solvable at the level of knowledge or pedagogy, actually. Because a lot of the investments and identifications we have with those things that matter to us are profoundly invested in ways which we are not able to fully know or exercise. And there are scholars who argue that you can educate people out of these things, but they tend to reduce racism to a habit of thinking or misthinking, rather than say fundamental to the question of thought itself, which is where I'm kind of going. And if that's the case, it's my problem. I locate the problem at the level of grammar, thought, at level of language, sorry, more so than at the level of simply representations. So avoiding certain representations while thinking them or fantasizing about them or desiring them does not free you from those thoughts. So, it's just anti-racist education may well police your social cues, but I don't know if it shifts anything fundamental. That's almost like an epistemological revolution. I think it's very hard to teach at. Yeah, there's one more question. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I think you were referring to a passage in that Fanon book. Yeah, it's like there's a debate between Moten and Sexton on the question of optimism versus pessimism. Again, I think it's a false opposition, as I try and show that in that book, because there's something about deeply pessimistic about Moten's reading of optimism, something very affirmative about Sexton's reading of pessimism. But it seems to me that one of the big debates in Black philosophy or Black critical theory is about the question of transformation versus liberation, if you like. And one of the many things that Moten has said, and not really elaborated, he says that blackness is avant-garde, which is a military metaphor in itself. And he's also said that in a very crude misreading of Fanon, that Fanon simply essentializes or pathologizes blackness. Where I come from, given my background in kind of close readings of philosophy and psychoanalysis, there's a strong sense of pessimism and a strong sense of optimism, and a strong sense of pessimism which says no to everything would have to also implicitly say no to blackness. You couldn't just simply maintain it as the antidote to the no, because that's a weak sense of pessimism. The strong sense of optimism, you'd have to basically, and I think Moten has actually said this, you'd have to go and say the thing which race in itself is just a stepping stone to a more solid universal, which is a classic move. And Moten has actually made that move himself. So, it's about, going back to your question, it's about, can white people be black? And it's always asked from that point of view, by the way, which tells you everything you need to know. And he says yes, because of your identifications. Again, that strikes me as too quick, and the idea that that one can know what blackness is also for me a bit too quick, given its elusiveness, given that it's always defined negatively. in relationship to everything else. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't be too quick to name one's enemy, because it might be your own thinking. Yeah. Thank you.